Hi everyone, this week's lecture we are covering two communication theories. As I mentioned before, on Blackboard I put up that book by M. Griffin on communication theory, and these are two of the more popular theories that have been used in this class by a number of students, so I thought it'd be important to go over these right here. So the first one we are going to start with is social penetration theory. And one of the easiest ways of thinking about this theory is thinking about that scene from Shrek, right, where they're talking about ogres having layers, and that's the main thing I want you to keep in mind as we're going through all the basic facets of this theory. So a social penetration theory, so they talk about the process of developing deeper intimacy with another person with mutual self-disclosure and other forms of vulnerability. Now, typically this theory is more geared towards romantic relationships and even friendships, but I've always found some benefit from applying this to the workplace, given everything we've covered in the first couple of weeks, the videos that were posted, where we talk about the importance of storytelling and narrative and opening up lanes of communication with your team members. And so very similarly, the way that you would disclose information to someone you were romantically interested in, or to someone who's a new colleague or a new acquaintance that you'd like to become a friend, I do think there is a benefit in doing something very similar with your team members. In terms of the idea of the onion, social penetration believes this idea that your personality is like a structure, right? It's onion-like layers of beliefs and feelings about the self, others, and the world. Deeper layers are more vulnerable and protected, and they're central to your self-image. So the entire basis of social penetration theory is on self-disclosure, right? So this is a voluntary sharing of personal history, preferences, attitudes, feelings, values, secrets with another person. It's all about transparency, and I think we all understand that inherently just in the conversations that we've had with people as we get to know each other. If you think about even the times you may have been sitting at a restaurant, or let's say you go to a bar to watch a game, if you have a person next to you, eventually you might get to talking, and you really just talk about surface level ideas like where do you work, what do you do, little things like that. Obviously, if you're at a bar, sometimes alcohol can lead to a more rapid pace of self-disclosure, but just in general, I think we're all familiar with this idea, given everyone's experience either with dating or just building new friendships. And in terms of what we're thinking about in terms of the personality, there's depth and then there's breadth. So depth is the degree of disclosure in a specific area of an individual's life, and the breadth is a range of areas in an individual's life over which disclosure takes place. So breadth is all of the different topics and subject matters that someone could cover when they're talking to you. And the depth is really how much information they're willing to give about one particular subject, right? So it's one thing to say, yeah, I root for this team, and I go to this church, or, yes, I'm married. And then as you get deeper, you start talking about things like, how long have you been married? How many kids do you have? And then as you start developing friendships, or if you start working with someone for long enough, it'll be like, well, you build that trust, and you start sharing about things that are going on at home. You may even share things about going on with other coworkers that maybe you don't feel comfortable sharing with other people. But all of that is more about the depth and how much you're willing to share with somebody else. And in terms of a visual, this is what that would look like, right? So here's the depth of disclosure, here's the breadth of disclosure, of self-disclosure. So there's biographical data, the preferences in clothes and food, different studies, tastes, worldview, dating, all these different things here. But then as you get deeper, right, your religious convictions, your deeply held fears and fantasies, your concept of yourself, whatever goals and aspirations. And that's where I think this idea right here, your goals and aspirations, as leaders, we should be focusing on not just the goals of the organization, but what are the individual goals of our team members, right? Because if we're talking about morale, if we're talking about people enjoying what they're doing and enjoying where they're working, a lot of that has to do with finding a way of engaging their own goals and their own aspirations. And you're only going to figure that out if you're engaging in dialogue and figuring out different ways of understanding what those goals and aspirations are, and seeing if those can kind of meet along with the overall team and organization's goals. Also, if you hear squeaking right now, that's probably my dog I got a couple months ago that just decides in the middle of the night that she likes to chew on or chew twice. Just thought I'd let you know in case you can hear that. Social penetration theory. Okay, so people are looking for reciprocity when it comes to disclosure, and I think that the best about this is, if you think about romantic relationships, right? If you think about the first date, it's a lot of like, well, here's where I work and this is what I do. Oh, okay, well, this is where I work and this is what I do. And then you go back and forth, and it's a give and take, right? Like, this person just shared this very personal thing with me, so now I feel comfortable and I'm going to share this one personal thing about myself. And so we're always looking for reciprocity when it comes to self-disclosure, and similarly, you're going to look for that in the workplace, right? In terms of what a social exchange is, right? The relationship behavior and status regulated by both parties' evaluations of perceived rewards and costs of interactions with each other. So essentially, anytime we get into a dialogue with someone and then there's this idea of self-disclosure going on, we are constantly thinking, like, what are the costs and benefits of me sharing information with this person? And that's somewhat of a hurdle you'll have to go over in a leadership position, because the people that you're talking to, they're going to be thinking, okay, what are the possible costs of me sharing this information with someone who is in a position of leadership, right, or a position of power, right? Could this come around and hurt me? Right? Am I being too vulnerable and they're going to see me as weak? Like, there are a lot of different things that are going to go on, and your job as a leader is to put those worries or those thoughts of costs, put them aside, and that way they're willing to self-disclose with you. Now, I'm not encouraging you all to self-disclose way too much either, right? There should still be a fine line of delineation between, having a good, friendly conversation and making sure that they always remember that you're still in that leadership position, and kind of what you say goes. But I think it's there's a delicate line that you have to walk, but I think it is absolutely possible to figure out a balance between those things if you're taking the time to communicate with your team. So in terms of some of the rules here, so peripheral items are exchanged more frequently and sooner than private information. That's pretty much common sense, right? We're more likely to talk about surface level things when we first meet somebody than we are to share some of these more deep, meaningful items about ourselves. Self-disclosure, like we said, is reciprocal. Sorry about that. Especially in the early stages of relationship development, right? So we are patient and calm and kind of taking our time when we first get to know somebody. And you have to take that same approach, especially if you get dropped in a leadership position. I know a lot of folks apply for jobs and they jump from one organization to another, and all of a sudden you're in this position of leadership and you're dealing with an entire organization that kind of been working together for a certain amount of years or months or whatever it might be. And now you have to start slowly beginning these stages of getting to know your team and going beyond just, oh, well, I know what your name is and what department you work at, but really getting to know who they are and what potential benefits they provide to yourself and to the organization in general. Social penetration is rapid at the start, but slows down quickly as the tightly wrapped inner layers are reached, right? So this is one aspect where it'll differ from a romantic relationship, because like I said, there should be a line, right? We should not be trying to get too much information from our team members, but I do think there's a benefit if you're focusing in on the goals and aspirations of your team members. I think it's a good idea to have these check-in moments where you sit down and say, okay, here's what the goal of your department or your job or what this organization is looking for, but on the side, like what is your 5-year plan? Right? We know what your job and your role is with us, but in terms of 5 years, where do you see yourself, or where do you want to be? Is it still with this organization? Like, how can I help you get there? Because I think we have to understand that our team members, as much as we want them to contribute to our organization, they may have aspirations beyond the organization, and that's okay, right? You're always going to have someone else that you can pull into that position, but letting them succeed and helping them succeed can only help bring in more talent as your reputation for helping others becomes more known. Depenetration is a gradual process of layer by layer withdrawal. That's, again, typically more for a romantic relationship. That may happen if you think you're about to have to let somebody go and someone's kind of walking on thin ice in terms of their job. But that part of social penetration theory isn't as applicable when it comes to the workplace, but I want to make sure we still cover that for this lesson. Okay, So we have the minimax principle of human behavior. So people seek to maximize their benefits and minimize their costs. So anytime we're engaging in a conversation, we like getting information about other people, but sometimes we have to make sure we're always kind of cognizant of exactly how much we're sharing about ourselves. Comparison level of alternatives, essentially in whether it's in a relationship, whether it's in a friendship, or whether it's in a workplace, right? We are constantly trying to figure out, okay, is the situation I'm in satisfactory and more attractive to me than other potential alternatives that are out there? And that's what we're constantly doing in romantic relationships. That's what we're doing in friendships. That's what we're doing in the workplace. And particularly in the workplace, right? We are trying to create an environment where the dialogue that's going on, the communication that's happening, people are constantly trying to understand or trying to figure out for themselves, is this where I want to be? Is there another opportunity that might present itself that might be better than the current situation that I'm in? So all of those different things you have to think about in terms of self-disclosure by yourself, and the self-disclosure that your team members are engaging in. And that is social penetration theory. The next theory I want to talk about, and was one that I wrote for my dissertation, and my mentor wrote about this quite a bit, is speech codes theory. And it's often tied together with the ethnography of communication, but we're not going to get into that. I just want to focus on speech codes theory. Now, when I pulled a lot of this information for the lesson, I'm using a lot of the verbiage that is used in a lot of the textbooks that focus in on speech codes theory. But essentially what speech codes theory is all about is this idea that wherever you are, whether it's a small group, whether it's organization, if you think about your families, it could be cultural, racial, but wherever there is a unique culture, there's going to be a unique way of speaking, whether it's verbally or non-verbally. And that's entirely what speech codes theory is about. And a lot of people find it useful because anytime you jump into a new organization, there's going to be speech codes. One example I like using, because our department typically teaches at Fort Bliss, and a lot of a vast majority of our students are in the military, when they start talking to one another, there's a lot of talking in acronyms. And so anybody who's not part of the military has no idea what's going on. And that's just one small example of a speech code. So let's go ahead and get started on this one. So it's created for two purposes. Distill what could be learned from a large body of fieldwork research on culturally distinctive ways of speaking, and provide a focus for further research and discussion. So essentially, again, you're trying to figure out distinctive ways of speaking within a particular organization or group of people. Some of the defining characteristics: it's grounded in the observation of communicative conduct in particular times and places. It posits a way to interpret, explain, observe communicative conduct, and provides a general understanding of communicative conduct. So essentially, even the military here at Fort Bliss specifically, though, and specific to the ones that are enrolled in our program, they may have their own unique speech codes compared to those folks in the military in a completely different city or state. Right. So there are similarities, maybe if you think about some of the larger organizations, but even in the smaller kind of those smaller groups under the umbrella of the larger organization also have their own individual speech codes. So what is a speech code? A system of socially constructed symbols and meanings, premises and rules pertaining to communicative conduct. And so really focus in on this idea of something being socially constructed. Right. One of the examples I like using is 15, 20 years ago, if someone asked you how a party was and you said it was lit, people would be like, well, did you call the fire department? Like, what was there an emergency? Because they had no idea what you're talking about. That's just a small example of how we've decided that word means a particular thing. We do that all the time for essentially our entire language is socially constructed. We have come to understand what these different things are and what we call them. And we just, for this theory, we're getting more specific into how people use specific terms within a small group or organization. So in terms of different propositions of speech code theory, the first one is wherever there is a distinctive culture, there is to be found a distinctive speech code. And usually there are multiple speech codes. In any given community, multiple speech codes are deployed. A speech code implies a culturally distinctive psychology, sociology, and way of speaking, right? There's different ways of getting along with one another. Oftentimes it's really through nonverbal behavior and communication, right? If you think about some of the ways that your family kind of have their sneaky ways of talking to one another so that no one else around you understands, that's a prime example of a speech code. The significance of speaking is dependent upon the speech codes used by inside members to constitute the meanings of communicative acts. All that really means is speech codes are dependent on the fact that people use them, right? So people within that organization regularly use these speech codes. And so researchers who are looking at, are studying speech codes, usually what they do, like my mentor went and worked at a construction site for like 12 months. And all she did was every single day show up and take notes. And so from looking at that, she is looking at different ways people are speaking to one another, different nonverbal communication that's going on. And through that kind of that rigor of going through and taking notes on all of these different things, was she able to figure out, okay, all these members, these inside members that are part of this organization, they're all using X, Y, and Z, so that's why this is a relevant speech code. Proposition 5. So the terms, rules, and premises of a speech code are inextricably woven into the speaking itself, right? That means that there's not like, it's almost like there has to be, it's like an unwritten rule where people are just, the way they're speaking and the way they kind of interact with one another, it just naturally is a part of the way things go. And so that's why it makes it easy for researchers who take this time and look at the way people are speaking, communicating. It's easy for them to figure out what these speech codes are because they're used so frequently. And lastly, the artful use of a shared speech code is a sufficient condition for predicting, explaining, and controlling the form of discourse about the intelligibility, prudence, and morality of communicative conduct. And so the best example I'll give for this one is, so I'm really big into fantasy football, so I decided that I was going to write my dissertation on fantasy football and the way that folks in that community speak to one another, because I noticed that even that there was even a difference between the way folks in regular football analysis for the NFL, that there was a difference between the way that they communicate and the way that fantasy football analysts communicate. And so I looked at all of these things, and essentially the question I was trying to answer is if you had no idea what fantasy football was all about, but you wanted to be able to like successfully communicate to people in the community, what are some words or some phrases or some rules about speaking that you would have to employ to either understand or to communicate to that group of people? Now, it doesn't mean that you can't have a regular conversation with people in fantasy football. Similarly, like you wouldn't be similarly like I can have conversations with my students who are in the military. It just means that there are small nuances that I would have to learn to then be able to communicate as easily with some of my students as I do with everybody else. Similarly, folks would have to know some of these terms and phrases of fantasy football just to understand and to have a good dialogue and where understanding is met or exchanged, if you want to be a part of that fantasy football community. So I have a lot of students who end up using speech codes theory for that reason, because it is so easy to see that there are a number of different organizations that employ multiple speech codes, and some folks like using their own organization, or they'll look at different commercials that organizations use and kind of see what kind of phrases or terms or words that they're using. But these two theories were the most popular by far of students that have used for the final paper for this course. So those are the two theories I wanted to go over, and that is a lecture for week 3.